What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This episode number 588. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line, all the way from Denver, Colorado, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, how are you, bud? What's going on?
Oh, I'm good. Despite the snowpocalypse, the weather's kind of gotten to the place where I'm back hoofing it again. So even though my walk was tragically cut short by having to do the show, I'm going to get back out there once the show's over.
Yeah, apologies for that. I needed to go a little earlier today because I'm going to go on Weekly MTG over on the Wizards channel after this and talk about Timespiral Remastered, which is incidentally what we're going to be talking about in the episode this week. And then a little later in the day, I've got the Sweatsuit Invitational, which is a thing that Hunter Pence does with, it's like a draft bracket. So that should be fun. Hopefully we can pick up some wins on our way there as well. But again, this episode of the show, that's right, Timespiral Remastered. We're going to be doing the primer show for this to help get you ready. We know that most of our listeners don't play these remastered, or particularly the Modern Master style sets that often. They come around for a relatively short period of time, and sometimes they have a premium price attached to them as well. So it usually limits how many drafts you end up actually doing compared with like a normal expert level set. So rather than doing the entire card by card set review, we are doing the primer, which will get you acclimated to what's going on in the set in the big picture, and maybe even give you a few ideas of what you can draft when you sit down to do it. Before we get into that, gotta mention our sponsor, channelfireball.com. That's the place to go for all things Magic related. You know, really anything you need, you're going to find over at CFB. A lot of people just buy singles, right? They want to fill out their commander deck or their standard deck or modern or whatever. That's great. That's probably the most efficient way to get the cards you need into your hand. But you can also buy sealed product. You know, you can get a box of Timespiral Remastered. When things ease up a bit with the pandemic, you can draft it with your friends and, boom, there you go. You've got some product in your hands at the end of it. You know, a lot of times, what we do here, when we actually are able to get together is, somebody will provide the product and draft it, and they just take the cards after. You know, if they wanted to open up the box anyway, well, might as well do a draft with those cards. That's a pretty common way to do it. And of course, you can pick up that sealed product and many others over at Channel Fireball. And if you're kind of into the whole opening packs thing, they've got something pretty cool that you can try. It's called Box Breaks, and it's where you buy basically like a share of a box, a portion of a box or a pack, something like that. And then, but you don't know what you're going to get until it's opened up, and then it gets allocated to you. And the cool part is you get to watch. They do it live on stream. And so you get to actually watch your product get open, and it's a really fun sweat. I did a couple of them a couple weeks ago, and, yeah, it was really fun to figure out what you're going to get, especially when you get a foil Goldspan Dragon and a not foil Goldspan Dragon.
You're really riding that Goldspan Dragon for all it's worth, aren't you?
Dude, I got it sitting right here. I really do. It's like, here. I'll bust it out.
Know that I've got the Giant Strength and Kobolds of Carekeep that I won from my Legends Pack Box Breaks sitting right behind my computer as well.
Yeah, I got these Goldspan Dragons just flying around my office right now. By the way, you know what else I got out of that pack that you might be interested in? Let me see. Where did it go? Here it is. I got a foil alternate art, alternate frame, Burgy God of Storytelling, your favorite Storm card here, Luis. I got the Harnfell Horn of Bounty / Burgy. Maybe I'll hang on to that one just for you, bud, just so you can have it, because you are the biggest proponent of it in Vintage Cube, which, by the way, is going right now. We're not going to be talking about that on this episode, but yeah, if you're into Vintage Cube. Anyway, check out channelfireball.com for all of that and more, including box breaks and anything else you need. If you do end up buying something over at CFB, if you would use the affiliate code LR at checkout, that helps us out, and we appreciate it. Patreon is where you can go to support the show directly. Patreon.com/limited resources. It's really kind of the lifeblood of the show, and we really appreciate everybody who heads over there. All the information's there. It's super transparent. It's super adjustable. You can get it exactly to fit your current lifestyle. And if that changes, you can change with it as well. It's all there at patreon.com/limited resources. Speaking of patreon.com/limited resources, Luis, we need to do a Patreon question of the week, but I forgot to grab one. So I'm going to do that right now. Live on the show. How exciting is this?
There we go.
The way this
if
works,
I was a patron, if I was a patron myself, I could ask a question here, but I'm not allowed in the Patreon. I couldn't even help you look at the questions.
That would have been nice if you were a patron of the show. Yeah. And by the way this works, if you've ever wondered, is as a patron, you get access to the Patreon feed, which lets you see all the stuff that we post for patrons only. And that includes the threads that have the question of the week refresh threads, which is what I'm looking at right now.
So it's kind of like an only patrons, if you will.
Wow. No. Don't even start with that. I already saw that there was like this calendar thing. I'm like, no. Let's see. Here's a question from Matthias, who says, "Hi, Marshall and Luis, big fan of the podcast, and I've been enjoying your streams over the last couple of weeks. Thank you for that. I found that my win percentage seems to take a dive whenever there is something at stake. Even if the stakes are extremely small, are there any tips to stay focused and on top of your game, even in high stakes matches? Thanks for all the great content, Matthias." Boy, that's interesting. We mentioned this on our Q&A episode about the, how to stay not nervous and get overwhelmed by the moment. But this is kind of on the other end of that spectrum, Luis, where Matthias is saying, it takes a dive whenever there's anything at stake, even if it's extremely small. Like, I'm assuming we're talking about, when is there not something at stake, I guess, is another question.
I would say that most ladder play on Arena does not feel like there's much at stake. Mm-hmm. Like when you're close to like getting into a new tier, or you're like trying to hit Mythic or those things, sometimes it can. But I would say most ladder games, at least to me, don't feel particularly high stakes,
Mm-hmm. But then again, a GP match doesn't feel particularly high stakes to you.
Well,
you're probably the
a GP
worst
match
person.
Still does. If I'm playing in a GP, mm-hmm. I flew there, almost
True.
every time. Like, I paid for the entry fee. I got a deck together. I did all those things. Like, I care a lot about how I do. So I would say that feels like high stakes. I think the question is like, what about being a match having stakes makes you play worse? Or maybe do you just notice that you play worse in those matches? It's possible that you also have a little bit of a selection effect where you don't really notice mistakes in lower stakes matches because like it kind of doesn't matter. So you're not that worried about it. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's interesting. What we mentioned on the other one about the higher stakes matches was that you generally get used to it. That kind of tends to be the trend, is that like you have to kind of just walk through that to get through it. But this sounds like something different, Matthias, because you probably would have gotten used to it already, because I'm assuming you've played enough matches for stakes that make you feel weird or whatever, that you would have gotten used to it by now. So it might be something beyond that. One thing that happens a lot in the poker world is people play worse when they play at stakes that are too expensive or too much for them. I don't know if that's the case here, but there also is just a chance that they call it playing over your bankroll, like, where you're basically risking more than you're comfortable risking. So maybe that could be something to look into if it is, something along those lines. But yeah, it's kind of a tough one to try to sort out, because normally you will just get used to it over time. And I assume that would be true for you too as well. Okay. We got a cracker pack here, Luis, and I actually have a time spiral pack. So Wizard sent me this box, and I'm going to use it to build some sealed on the weekly MTG that I mentioned before. But that means that we get the continued actual cards in hand. Hold on. Ooh, wow, that's kind of a different. Yeah, wow, that smells interesting. All right, so let's get right into it. Now, there's going to be a lot of reading here because this set is ultra complicated. The whole block was, and they took, a bunch of the complicated cards and put it in here. So let's just dive in. First card up is Reality Acid. It's 2 and a blue for an enchantment aura that enchants a permanent. It has Vanishing 3, which means basically after every turn, one of those counters goes away. And after the last one's gone, this thing goes away. It says when Reality Acid leaves the battlefield, enchanted permanent's controller sacrifices it. So really bad removal. I mean, really just awful removal. So
yes, but there is a combo, and both of the cards from the combo are in Timespiral Remastered, which is a Tolarian Sentinel. It's 3 and a blue for a 1/3 flyer. And you can pay a blue and tap it, discard a card, return target permanent you control to its owner's hand. And the way these two cards interact is Reality Acid says leaves play. So you can play Tolarian Sentinel and then put Reality Acid on their thing and immediately bounce it and just kills their thing. You get a repeatable removal spell. So I definitely have played Reality Acid when I've got Tolarian Sentinel in my decks. I also definitely love Tolarian Sentinel more than most people because it opens the door for a lot of nonsense.
Okay, so how would you recommend this is the type of card that you pick up later, and if you have combos, you play it, or would you play it just straight up?
I would not play it straight up, and I would not pick it highly, but it has a use case. Literally one specific use case.
All right, this next card is called Empty the Cheons. It is 3 and a red for a sorcery. Create 2/1/1 red goblin creature tokens, and it has Storm. Can you play Empty the Warrens in just regular draft if you're not building around it?
Well, no, not if you're not building around it. You can't just put it in your deck because for it to be good, you really want to make 6 goblins. Making 4 goblins is not good enough because if you were to make 4 goblins off it, it means you waited until you could play another spell. Though, of course, it combos really nicely with Suspend as well because it's a free spell on that turn. But it's just not worth the effort. However, if you can get to 6 goblins or more, then the card actually becomes good. And the way you do that is with Suspend cards, with Coal Stoker. That's the 3 and a red, 3/3 that ETBs and adds 3 red. So it's a 1 mana card kind of when it comes to Storm, or with cheap spells. So what you would do is you'd like suspend a Keldon Halberdier. It comes in, you play a Coal Stoker, you cast like Gone or Dead from Dead Gone for a shock, and then you cast Warrens for 8. And then it's really good. But
okay,
again, not a card you take early. And it may seem like all of these cards have some weird application. Well, that's Timespiral for you. It's just a set full of cards that it's like, wow, this card seems bad, except when you do this. And that's kind of the beauty of the set, while also being what makes it a somewhat difficult set to parse.
All right. Next is Primal Plasma. This is 3 and a blue for a star. As it enters the battlefield, it becomes your choice of a 3/3 creature, a 2/2 flyer, or a 1/6 with defender.
This one I didn't like so much. It's 3 underrate cards all in one.
You can pick your underrate variety. Yeah, that seems not great. This one's kind of interesting. It's called Mind Stab. It's 5 and a black for a sorcery. Target player discards 3 cards, but it has Suspend 4, and that's just a black mana. So you can pay a black, and then 4 turns later, this thing will get cast without you having to pay for it.
So Mind Stab is the Suspend experience more than most Suspend cards. And what I mean by that is when you suspend a card, you usually get a fantastic deal on it. When you open on a turn 1 Dirkwood Baloth or Mind Stab or Keldon Halberdier, it feels like you broke it because you're going to end up spending 1 mana on a card that's realistically worth about 5 mana. Like all of these cards that you suspend cost about 1 more than they should. Baloth is more of like, it's a 6 mana 5/5. You'd be more willing to pay 5 for it. Mind Stab, you'd be willing to pay 5, but it costs 6 because it has Suspend. So you really do get away with something when you do something like this. But when you draw it later, Mind Stab is pretty mediocre. At least Baloth and Keldon Halberdier are a little bit more reasonable. Mind Stab is just a little bit too expensive. So I would tend to play the card and just understand that sometimes you're going to high roll it and it's going to be incredible for you. It's going to be a 1 mana discard 3, which even if they see it coming, they usually can't get all the cards out of their hand by then. So it's going to eat 3 cards. Yeah. Like there's not much they can do about it. And even if it eats 2, you spent 1 mana to get the last 2 cards out of their hand.
Yeah.
Then you're going to draw it sometimes on turn 4 and it's going to be like, wow, this card is awful.
Yeah,
so just be aware it has both these things. Not an early pick, but definitely a playable card.
This next one's one of my favorites from this set. It's Sentinel Woodreaders, 2 and a green for a 1/4. Just nice and safe blocker, but it has kicker. You could pay an additional 2 and a green, and if you do, you draw 2 cards when it ETBs. Yeah, baby.
Yeah, Sentinel Woodreaders is quite good. It's a little bit expensive, 6 mana is no joke, but in general, it is a card worth playing because it can protect you from early rushes, and then you can also just play it for 6 mana as like a kind of ground mole drifter. So probably my pick so far, but I'm not really juiced about any of these cards.
Next is a sliver. They've put the slivers, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but they've put them primarily in the Naya colors, the green, white, and red. This one's white is called Lymph Sliver. It's 4 and a white for a 3/3. All sliver creatures have Absorb 1. If a source would deal damage to a sliver, prevent 1 of that damage.
So absorb is a lot stronger than you probably give it credit for. All these kinds of effects are really annoying. Like imagine you attack with this 3/3. They can double block with 2/2s and it won't kill it.
Yeah.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
it'll prevent one of that source, and that sort of thing adds up. That said, first picking a 5-mana 3/3 sliver is not a great place to be.
Yeah. Next is Rift Elemental. This is red for a 1/1 elemental. It has the activated ability, 1 in a red, remove a time counter from a permanent you control or suspended card you own. And the Rift Elemental gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So primarily for suspended cards, you can actually hasten their entry here and then even get a little buff on the Rift Elemental.
Yeah, I always found this card to be pretty bad. It just, when it comes together, you're spending 2 mana to remove a time counter, which is kind of taking back the mana you saved on suspend.
Yeah.
And when it doesn't come together, it's 2 mana or 1 mana 1/1 that has no abilities. So yeah, I would avoid the Rift Elemental.
Infiltrator Ilkor is next. It's 4 and a blue for a 3/1 core rogue. It has shadow, which means it can block or be blocked only by creatures with shadow. And it also has suspend 2 for 1 and a blue. This set is absurd, by the way. Like,
it's absurd.
What the hell?
This card's really good. I like Infiltrator.
Oh, is it?
Suspend 2 is really fast. And a 3/1 shadow is basically just a 3/1 unblockable. So it can't
has
block
haste
either,
when it comes in. It can really start slamming. Yeah,
so
okay.
You suspend this on turn 2. On turn 4, you're hitting them with an unblockable 3/1, which is, 5 mana for a 3/1 unblockable is not even outrageous. Like, I would want to pay 4 probably, but this follows the trend of suspend cards usually being about 1 mana more than they would be to cast manually.
Okay. Next is Watcher Sliver. This is 3 and a white for a 2/2 that gives all slivers +0/+2. Ugh. So it's a 2/4.
Better than it looks, because it's a 4 mana 2/4 that can pump your team +0/+2, but only really in the slivers deck. So I was never that high on the slivers decks. I found that mostly the 5-color slivers deck had a trouble coming together unless you had multiple Gemhide slivers. That's the 1 and a green 1/1 that makes all your slivers into Birds of Paradise. Mm-hmm. But once you do have those Gemhide slivers, like, it is pretty powerful. You assemble, like, imagine if you have a Watcher sliver and a Lymph sliver from these packs. All your slivers have +0/+2 and absorb 1. They're really hard to kill at that point.
Okay. Next is Knight of Circe. This is 3 and a white for a 2/2 human knight. It's got flying and flanking. Whenever a creature without flanking blocks this creature, the blocking creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. And it also has suspend 3 for a white.
So I get bringing back flanking. It is a very, like, old school thing, but flanking is such a punishing mechanic. The reason you don't really see it in sets is like, oh, you attack their 2/2, I'll block with my 3/1. Okay, your 3/1 just dies. Oh, I see. Okay, well, I'll block with 2/2s. Okay, well, they both become 1/1s. Like, flanking is a really punishing mechanic. That said, Knight of Circe is nothing special. It's fine. You put it in your deck, but I don't think it's a card I want to take early.
Yeah, it seems like having it be on a 2/2 with flying anyway just effectively says you're probably just not going to be able to block with anything reasonably. But they can also just take the 2 and not have, like, a horrible thing. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, it's just a hard to block creature that's already kind of hard to block, so not a big deal.
That brings us to the uncommons. The first one up is Harmonize. It's 2 GG for sorcery, draw 3 cards.
Yeah, Harmonize is a good card. I would take Harmonize out of this pack. It's not the best aggressive card, but green is not a very aggressive color, so I'm fine paying 4 mana to draw 3 cards. That's just a good deal.
Yeah, so that's a nice one. The next card is Firewake Sliver. That's 1 green red for a 1/1. All sliver creatures have haste. And by the way, these are the uncommons, of course. And all slivers also have 1, sacrifice it, and target sliver gets +2/+2 until end of turn. That's pretty good.
So it's funny, they make all your slivers into Fires of Yavimaya.
Yeah.
And Firewake Sliver is the kind of card is terrible unless you already have a sliver deck. So slivers come in really 2 categories. The first is slivers you just put in your deck because they're good cards. Like Gemhide Sliver is a really good example of that. By itself, it's 1 and a green for a 1/1 that taps for any color of mana. Always play that card in a green deck, right? It's just a good card. And then there's cards like Firewake Sliver that can be very good when you have 10 slivers in your deck, but are pretty terrible outside that. So I wouldn't take Firewake early for sure.
Okay. Our last uncommon is Timebender. This is blue for a 1/1 human wizard. It has morph for blue, and it says when Timebender is turned face up, choose one. You can either remove 2 time counters from target permanent or suspended card, or put 2 time counters on target permanent with a time counter on it or suspended card. That's pretty mean.
So there's like 3 or 4 cards in this vein of like messing with suspend cards, like Clock Spinning, Timebender. We saw the Rift Elemental. None of them hit. They all fell flat. I think that they all basically were misses. So I would not play Timebender, and would generally recommend against doing so. That said, it's a morph. You can always just put a morph in your deck. The cost of playing a morph is really not that high, so they always make a good 23rd card, but you can almost always do better than Timebender.
All right. Our rare is Slaughter Pact, which is a 0 mana instant that destroys a non-black creature. And you probably are thinking, what's the catch here? And there's a big catch. At the beginning of your next upkeep, pay 2 and a black. If you don't, you lose the whole game. You just lose.
I wasn't thinking that because I knew what Slaughter Pact does. But it's a 0 mana kill spell that you have to pay for later. First of all, a 3 mana kill spell is already a great deal. The fact that this costs 0 is so brutal. You'll be tapped out, and your opponent will like play a combat trick, and you'll just be like, Slaughter Pact, just destroy you. So I would definitely take Slaughter Pact here. It's splashable, though. And you know what? You can cast this without black mana. If you're going to win the game that turn, high risk, high reward, but kill their last blocker and kill them. If you like, let's say you splash it in a blue-white deck, you haven't drawn black, and you think this is going to be the last turn of the game if this attack works, well, yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Slaughter Pact's a good card. And then, interestingly, so one of the things we're going to talk about when we get into the nitty-gritty here is the time-shifted sheet. There's 121 cards in this set that are old border frame, even with some alternate artwork. And the one we got is actually sweet. It's Trigon Predator. So that's 1 blue-green for a 2/3 flyer that whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may destroy target artifact or enchantment that player controls.
I would put Trigon Predator third in this pack, I think, after Slaughter Pact, then Harmonize, then Trigon. Trigon is a very strong card. Mm-hmm. A 3 mana 2/3 flyer is not weak, and the fact that it hunts down enchantments and artifacts is a pretty big game because there's just a decent amount of those. The set just happens to have some. So it's a no-cost way to hedge against those things. So the fact that it's a gold card, I think, makes it slightly worse than the other 2 cards. Still a good card, though.
Okay. So what do you end up taking at the end of the day? Do you take the Slaughter Pact? Do you take the Harmonize?
Slaughter Pact. I don't think it's close, actually. Slaughter Pact is it's a really powerful effect. If it was just 3 mana kill a creature, I could see taking Harmonize because Harmonize is a 3-for-1, right? It's quite strong. But Slaughter Pact's 0 mana, which just opens up so many possibilities of just getting to, again, destroy them when they use a combat trick, getting to double spell on the one turn, though you might have no spells on the next turn, but you just end up in a spot where you get to really maximize your mana and it's a lot stronger to have the option to double up on one turn, even if it costs you future turns, because you can just get so far ahead in that space that it just works out really nicely. So I really like Slaughter Pact. I would take that here.
Yeah, the other thing to consider, right, when you're making these type of decisions, because I think that when you look at these 3 cards, they kind of lay out what's important in this set, right? Harmonize and to an extent Trigon Predator give you cards basically, right? Particularly Harmonize, a slow sorcery speed 4 mana draw 3. It says something about the format. If that's the pick over a super, hyper efficient removal spell like Slaughter Pact. But what it really says is removal still matters. As much as it's tempting to think of these sets as Modern Master style sets, they're really not. These are remastered sets, meaning that they take usually the 3 sets that made up a block before, and they cull out all the cards that aren't really pulling their weight and try to kind of give you that same experience with the cards that are left over, both in limited and then getting the important cards out there. And so this is a limited set. Like this is a normal limited set. It is powered up a bit, but it's not insane. It's not the type of thing, where, they downshift good rares to uncommons for some of the Modern Master style sets where it's just like the power level is absurd. This is higher power than what original Time Spiral block was, but this is not up to that Modern Masters level. So removal still very much holds its own, and Slaughter Pack is the pick. Obviously, I'm taking Harmonize, though. Come on, don't be crazy, Louise. One of them gives you 3 cards. The other one only lets you take out 1 card. So I don't really know.
Yeah, that's fair. I actually, I mean, given that I haven't actually drafted Timespiral Remastered, yet, I wouldn't be completely shocked if at the end of the day, Harmonize ended up edging out the Slaughter Pact here. Like,
because 3 is more than 1.
Well, if the format has enough removal and is slow enough, Harmonize is going to be better. But Time Spiral had decent speed to it and did reward efficiency. Plus, Time Spiral had a lot of opportunities to draw cards. So it's whatever resource there's more of, right, is the one that becomes less prized. And my experience of Time Spirals between stuff like Mystical Teachings and Fathom Seer, like there's a bunch of, and Sentinel Wood Readers in the pack, like there's just a bunch of ways to draw extra cards. So being able to convert some of that speed or cards to speed is really valuable. And I mean, Mystical Teachings, for example, is excellent with Slaughter Pact. So
that's gross.
That's the sort of thing you want to think about.
Yeah, it's funny because like you made a really good case for Slaughter Pact just being good on its own, and then you also mentioned other cards that make it even better. It's like, can see where you're coming. Okay, let's get into the primer for this thing. So just broad strokes. This is Timespiral Remastered. As we mentioned, there's 209 regular cards plus 121 of the time shifted card. It comes out on March 19th. So just a couple of days, or actually tomorrow from recording this. It's a remastered set, which means it takes all the cards from the prior block that it's referencing. In this case, it was Time Spiral, which came out in 2006 and 2007. The sets were Time Spiral, Planar Chaos, and Future Sight. Then they remove a bunch of the cards and distill it down to a draftable set with sweet cards that people want to own. So it kind of fills those 2 niches. They also have the benefit of using modern design techniques and tools to create something that could be a better limited environment, particularly than what the sets were back then. So that's kind of cool. So every card in the set outside of the time shifted sheet that we mentioned are from one of those 3 sets, except for those 121 cards, which can be not from Time Spiral block. In fact, they are not from Time Spiral block. And they don't overlap with the time shifted sheet from the prior Time Spiral block. So these are all new cards like the one that we opened here. They have those old school Magic frames, which are, I'm surprised, Luis, at how awesome, like it's really kind of sparked a discussion in the community about how freaking awesome these frames look. And it is weird to look at them because I'm just going, wow, why did they change these? These are so great. And also they can be foil.
Yeah, I do think that the frames, especially on like the like blue and red cards, look really, really good. Well, green too, mostly just not black and white. So I do think that the new frames have a little bit better balance and that like all the colors look a little closer to each other, whereas the old frames, the teamer colors look stronger. I am amenable to the argument that the old frames are harder to read. They are. Like just the way the text looks and the white text versus black text does make it a little tougher. I still think they look better, but I understand why they did what they did. I also think that people get a little hung up on it being binary, where it's not old frames versus new frames. Like there's other possibilities in the space, which is why don't they make a frame that takes the strong parts of both?
Yeah,
like because I think the new frames don't look that good, and I think the old frames look very good, and I think there's accessibility issues and understanding issues with the old frames, but it seems like all these things are solvable. So who knows?
Yeah, so there you go. Kind of interesting. Also worth noting that they did experiment with alternate frame types, particularly in Future Sight. You know, the cards from Future Sight, they had time shifted cards from the past in one of the earlier sets, but Future Sight was supposed to be time shifting cards from Magic's future, which had things that, didn't exist yet and might not ever exist, in fact. But one of the things they did is they imported this futuristic looking card frame and said, well, what if that's what the card frame looks like in 15 years in Magic? Well, now we're about 15 years down the road, and no, that didn't happen. But anyway, they're not doing that for these. They're all in the normal card frame when you get them. Now, one thing to note here is that original Time Spiral block, particularly for limited, had a lot going on, like a ton. In fact, it was probably the most complex regular set release that they ever did from multiple angles. First off, a lot of the individual cards were callbacks or even like inside jokes for Magic players or card designers or people in R&D about Magic's past and even its theoretical future. I mean, so many of the cards were references to other cards or callbacks to other cards or, sort of a game design level joke about something that happened in Magic's past with the rules or the cards. I mean, that's how deep they went with this thing. And one of the results of that is that this set has a ton of just different individual mechanics represented in it, even with some of them appearing on like a single card in the set. So it's really tough to dive in. Here's a list of the things that you will see in this set. A normal set will have something like 2 to 3 mechanics that will be introduced and then some evergreen mechanics, think trample, flying, that kind of stuff. Well, these are the non-evergreen. So it has echo, flanking, flashback, morph, shadow, split second, suspend, vanishing, madness, delve, hellbent, domain, split cards, storm, cycling, kicker, absorb, convoke, protection, buyback, transmute, and poison. Which you will find all in Timespiral Remastered. So put on your seatbelt if you haven't ever done this. You're going to be doing a lot of reading. These are not simple mechanics either. Madness is weird. Domain counts how many basic land types you have. Okay, that one's pretty simple. Split second breaks people's minds. You cannot understand what split second is. You're just like, I can't do anything. And it happens like that every time when the first time you play against split second.
Yeah. So what split second is when a card with split second is on the stack, players can't cast spells or activate abilities and that aren't mana abilities. But you want to know something that's just also absurd? Huh. You can unmorph morphs in response to split second. Yes, you can. Because that doesn't count as either of those things. So it's just right. It's the sort of thing that wouldn't happen if Magic was a digital game because it goes against the spirit of split second. The whole idea is no one's able to do anything, but because unmorphing a morph just doesn't count as activating an ability or anything like that, it just doesn't get ruled out there. It's just, the whole thing is really absurd.
It is. Now, it does have some of the best limited mechanics really ever. I think my favorite limited mechanic is Flashback. That's in the set. Similar to these are cards.
How could it not have the best limited mechanics? It has all the limited
mechanics. It does have all of them. Yeah. It has Kicker, which I like a lot. Buyback gets kind of interesting. As well as, and Morph, right? And I mentioned this before, but, I really do tend to gravitate to sets that have a lot of cards like this or where it's the primary mechanics where it gives you options on spending your mana early or late so that you're not locked out of the game. If you stumble on mana, you can still get some type of effect. But if you draw these cards later in the game, you can get a bigger effect and they kind of scale with it. I find that those formats end up being really good. Cycling is along those lines as well. And I really like that. Some of the mechanics are really some of the greatest that we've had, but they're not easy to grasp. Like you really have to play with them for a while before you go, okay. Suspend is the one that comes to mind for me as the one that doesn't look good when you first read it. You think, well, that's going to take forever. And like, no, I'm not doing that. And then you play it and you're like, oh my God, like the turn when stuff comes off of Suspend is just insane. And as Luis described earlier, Suspend as a mechanic is you can just cast a spell, but it'll be overpriced for what you want. The best Suspend card that comes to mind at common is Errant Ephemeron, which is, by the way, in the set. And it's just an absolute staple in every format it's ever been printed in for limited. And it's a 7 mana 4/4 flyer. So not really where you want to be. That might even be, 2 mana above what you want to pay for it, but you can suspend it for 1 and a blue and it suspends for 4. So it takes 4 of your turns going by before it actually comes into play. And then it gets haste as well, just in case that's relevant. And you read that card and think like, I don't know. And you will just play as many of those as you can get your greedy little hands on. And, Suspend but Suspend has a lot of rules text and it's weird. I hate Split Second. I just can't stand it. It drives me nuts every time I do it. And if you haven't played with Morph yet, it's extremely weird as well. Like it's just this bizarre mechanic with flipping the card over and how you pay for stuff. But these, like for example, Morph and Suspend in my mind are two of the best mechanics for Limited that they've ever made. Like they make the format rich, diverse, interesting, and they're worth learning. So there's a lot here. Any advice, Louise, for people that, let's just say you started playing a year and a half ago or something and you're like, what is this nonsense?
Part of it is like part of the Timespiral experience is you should read all the cards. Like, look, we've already gotten a little used to this with Kaldheim, right? There's no rhyme or reason really with Kaldheim how cards work the way they do. Like, what do they count? Snow lands, snow permanents, all that. We've gone over that. Timespiral is similar, where a lot of the cards are kind of one-offs. They're not connected to other cards in the set in terms of how they work. And something like flanking, you should read flanking to make sure you know what it does. You should read absorb to make sure you know what it does. The other thing is suspend is generally stronger than you might think it is. I remember there was this quote unquote debate of, is Looter Ilkor or Errant Ephemeron the best blue common in Timespiral block? And I always thought Errant Ephemeron was the best, and it's just not even close. Like it ended up, very quickly not being close. And it's just because suspend, if we always talk about getting away with something. When you suspend a card on curve, you're getting away with something. You really
definitely.
You're spending 2 mana for a 4/4 flyer. Like that's coming at your opponent really fast. And it's really worth just keeping in mind that a lot of people who've played Timespiral before are telling you suspend cards are good. So even the ones that look kind of weak, like Keldon Halberdier, it's a good card. You just always play it in your red deck, and it will perform well for you. As for all the other stuff, it might seem overwhelming, and to some degree it is. But I think that a big part of it is you don't need to know every single card, all the like little ins and outs of all of it. The main themes are going to be the most important things to really kind of nail down, and the rest of the cards are just one-offs that it's not required you know every single thing about it to enjoy it and to do well with it.
And why don't we talk about that? So that kind of sets the stage for what you're looking at for this set and the level of complexity that you can expect to face. But what about the colors, the cards themselves? How do things break down as far as that goes from kind of big picture?
So let's just take a look at some of the themes that are in each color, because the way Timespiral works is primarily it's got two things going on. Well, it's got a lot more than two, but two main things going on. Each color has like a main theme, usually like one main theme, sometimes like two-ish main themes, and then a bunch of smaller like micro synergies where, like I said, Reality Acid's good with Tellurian Sentinel. You're going to find a lot of like pairings or 3 cards, like little groups of cards that work well together. And those are not things that might be immediately obvious, and we're certainly not going to be able to go over all of them today, but those are the kind of things that are going on here. So besides the main theme, there's a bunch of sub-themes. For 5-color, there's a 5-color slivers theme. There's just, good slivers in every color. All the slivers work together. Note that these are old school slivers. They affect your opponent's slivers as well. The M12 or M13, whatever core set slivers were in, M14 maybe.
14.
Those affected only your slivers. Well, these slivers affect everyone's. So be aware that when you play a sliver, it makes your opponent's slivers better and vice versa. The only way I've really found to draft 5-color slivers is to have Gemhide Sliver. So that's not an archetype I go into all the time, but it can be really busted. If you can get there, it's really good. White's strongest theme is Rebels, and it's really subsidized on the back of Amru's Scout. That's a 1 on a white for a 2/1. It's a Rebel. You pay 4 and tap it and search your library for a Rebel permanent with a mana cost 3 or less and put it on the battlefield. So let me talk about what this card's doing. First of all, it's a 2-mana 2/1, so not the most embarrassing, just to cast. You pay 4 and you tap it. You get a card, so you're up a card. Like straight up, just up a card at common. A repeatable way to get card advantage. You also get to put it directly onto the battlefield, so you're not even paying that much for it. You're paying 1 above what the card is, but this is not 4 to draw a card. This is more like 1 to draw a card.
Right.
If you think about it.
Because you get to cast it, yeah.
And it's instant speed. And it gives you some selection. At common, there's Amru Seekers, a 3-mana 2/2 hard to block. There's Bound in Silence. It's a 3-mana passivism that has the Rebel subtype because it's a tribal enchantment.
You can search up removal with this Scout. I mean, that's insane.
There's like Avon Riftwatcher, the 3-mana 2/3 flying, vanishing, gain some life, whatever. And there's a bunch of uncommon rebels as well, or some uncommon rebels as well. So Rebels is a very strong theme. That's actually both in black and white. They both each have a common Rebel Seeker. So black-white Rebels is the best of the Rebel decks, of course. But in general, if you have one or even luckier 2 Amru Scouts and you put 3 Rebels in your deck, you've got a Rebels deck. It doesn't have to have 15 Rebels. In fact, you rarely will have that. And that's just kind of how Timespiral is, where even this main theme it can be represented in as few as like 4 or 5 cards and still end up fairly profitable for you.
Yeah, one tip with the Amru Scout as well. The 2 things to mention. One that Luis mentioned is that it is instant speed, so when applicable, don't let your opponent know what you're about to go grab with it. But 2, make hay while the sun's shining. If you got an Amru Scout active, there's almost nothing you'd rather do than pay the 4 mana and start getting that, because they die to everything. They're 2/1s. So, and it's a white card. Like it will die. And people will understand that they need to kill it. So, if you find yourself in a position where you can activate your Scout or play like an OK 4-drop, activate the Scout. Like, just hammer that thing as many times as you can before it dies, because it will.
Yeah. Speaking of Amru Scout, a funny interaction is Amru Scout and Sudden Shock. That's the 2-mana shock that you can play without the possibility of there being a response. Sudden Shock gets the Amru Scout pretty good. So if you think your opponent could have a Sudden Shock in their deck, then sometimes you just want to activate it at the first available opportunity.
Main phase it. Yeah. Okay.
So a sub-theme for white is bouncing your own creatures. There's a common white main lion and then 2 uncommon Stonecloaker and Stormfront Riders that when they ETB, they bounce one of your own creatures, and that just it pairs with ETB effects or, gives you value, or creatures that give you value in some other way. It can also save your creatures from removal. But again, kind of a sub-theme.
Yeah, that I think is going to be what the blue deck's all about. Momentary Blink is in the set, which is 1 and a white to blink a creature. That's where we got the name from, I think. And and it has 3 and a blue flashback, and it's an instant. So you can blink. It's your own creatures. And so you can blink one of your creatures to get an enter the battlefield effect or to save it from its own vanishing or from a removal spell or something. And so I think you're going to see that be the blue-white deck. Anyway, go on.
Blue, it has Suspend, which has like Air and Ephemeron, Riftwind Cloudscape, like I mentioned, cards like Time Bender. But again, don't think of it as I'm drafting a Suspend deck. That doesn't really work. That's not how it plays out. How it plays out is you'll put the good Suspend cards in your deck and mostly ignore the Time Benders and Clock Spinnings of the set. It just doesn't actually end up working out in such a way that you really focus on that. I guess actually the literal card Clock Spinning is not in the set, but the point remains Time Bender is just not a card you really want to play because it just doesn't give you enough bang for its buck. Yeah,
that's the thing that if you're new to sets like this, you might think that you want to play all of those things, right? You're like, hey, I'm going to be a coherent, synergistic deck. I'm going to have everything that cares about Suspend, but it turns out that Suspend's good enough to stand on its own, so you don't need to. So just put other good cards alongside your Suspend cards, and you will win a lot.
Morphs is another thing. Blue has a lot of morphs and also has, some ways to take advantage of morphs, though mostly it's just put a bunch of morphs in your deck and those morphs do the good things. Like they have a rare Vesuvian Shapeshifter, which does play really well with other morphs. But in general, this is kind of like the Suspend thing where put the good morphs in your deck and be happy with them. Don't put the bad morphs in your deck. You don't need to do that. You can just play the good morphs like Fathom Seer or Shaper Parasite at Uncommon. Like these are just some pretty excellent morphs. And in general, if you didn't play with morphs when it was in cons, I think that was the last time morphs was around, right? Were they around more recently than that?
No, I don't think so. I think it was cons block.
Yeah.
Which was actually a really long time ago now.
Yeah, I don't even really want to think about how old Timespiral is.
Yeah.
Timespiral was literally before Limited Resources.
Yeah, it was before I played. The first set that I really came in on was a block after that. So
yeah, I mean, Timespiral was... Yeah, even for me, it came out just 14 years after I started playing Magic. So when you look at morphs in general, the cost of putting a morph in your deck is pretty low. You might think a 3-mana 2/2 is really bad, and well, it kind of is. But the thing is, your opponent doesn't know it's a 3-mana 2/2. They might think it's a 3-mana 2/2 that's going to flip into a 3/3 flyer or better. So if you have morphs that aren't very good and you're short on cards, you can always play morphs, even off-color ones like you can't flip, especially if you also have good ones and you're playing like best of 3, right? Mm-hmm. You're playing best of 3, and in game 1, you unmorph a Thelanite Hermit, the green deranged hermit. Well, in game 2, if you play a morph, they're probably going to take a turn off to kill it if they can.
Yes.
And you're like, haha, you got my time bender, and I'm not even playing blue. So
Right.
morphs are good. And then blue, this is the most synergistic of the blue themes, Madness. I really like this deck. This is the deck which is trying to combine cards with Madness, where when you discard a card, you can instead pay the Madness cost, which is almost invariably cheaper or has additional effects or both. So Madness is quite strong when you use it. For example, like Grave Scrabbler is just a 4-mana 2/2, but when you Madness it, it only costs 2 mana and you get to return a creature from your graveyard to your hand. So obviously, it's great with Madness, a 2-mana 2/2 Gravedigger, or it's terrible without that. Plus Madness, you can play at instant speed because you can always cast it whenever you discard it.
Yeah, and also Madness synergizes with the types of effects that you get, right? Because you're not actually discarding the card in that case, right?
Correct. That's the other thing. So, for example, blue has Looter Elcor at common, right? The 1/1 Shadow Looter. A lot of people probably know because it's always in cube. Well, you hit them with the Looter, you draw a card, and then you discard a Madness card and play it. It's like you didn't even discard a card. So you're up a card and you're up mana usually, like if you Looter into Reckless Worm. So Madness is a cool is a cool kind of a mechanic where you're going to try to combine. Blue has a lot of the discard outlets, with black having more of the payoffs.
Okay.
So that's usually how it ends up. So blue has Looter Elcor, Bonded Fetch, Dreamscape Artist. Dreamscape Artist is a weird one, by the way. It's 1 and a blue for a 1/1. It's a spell shaper, so it's these class of spells or creatures that you basically you pay mana and you tap them and you discard a card and they cast a spell, in this case Harrow. So I don't know why a blue card's casting Harrow, but it's 2 of blue and tap, discard a card, sack a land, search your library for 2 basic land cards and put them on the battlefield. Not tapped, by the way. So it ends up being a very strong card in the Madness decks because it lets you turn your cards into more lands that let you do more things while also madnessing out the cards. So
super sweet.
I really like Madness. I always found that one to be pretty fun.
And in Madness decks, the discard outlets, are those usually the bottleneck?
More often than not, finding good discard outlets is the problem because like, look at these discard outlets I've listed for blue, like Looter Elcor, Bonded Fetch, and Dreamscape Artist. These are all cards people would put in their decks without Madness cards.
Exactly.
Especially Looter and Bonded Fetch. These are both really good cards. Bonded Fetch is by the way, because I didn't say it's a 3-mana, 2 and a blue for an 0/2 Defender Haste that you can tap to draw a card and discard a card.
I love that card, man. It's just an 0/2 Defender with Haste is just too sweet.
Yeah. So the bottleneck's going to be on those because someone's blue-green deck is going to want Bonded Fetch because it's a good card. Whereas people tend not to put most of the Madness cards in their deck unless they can Madness them because they're usually costed at such a way to make it unappealing. For example, Dark Withering is 4 black for an instant to destroy a non-black creature, but it has Madness of a single black mana. So
Incredible.
It's a 6-mana removal spell or a 1-mana removal spell. Very feast or famine. Yeah. And in a deck with Bonded Fetch and Looter, it's absurd. In a deck without them, it's absurdly bad. Right. And so black has a lot of the payoffs like Grave Scrabbler, Dark Withering, Gorgon Recluse, all strong cards. One minor note on Gorgon Recluse, so this is 3 black for a 2/4 and it has Madness of double black, so just 2 mana. It doesn't exactly have Death Touch. This was before Death Touch. It has whenever Gorgon Recluse blocks or becomes blocked by a non-black creature, destroy that creature at the end of combat. So key differences, and this is Timespiral in a nutshell. You can't just say, oh, Gorgon Recluse basically has Death Touch, because it kind of does, but it doesn't work on black creatures, and it doesn't require it to deal damage. So as soon as it's declared as a blocker or becomes blocked, it sets up this delayed death trigger. So really,
terrible.
Definitely terrible, but also you got to know these things, if you play against these cards.
Yeah.
And then you have cards like Ichor Slick, which is just a premium black removal spell because it's 2 and a black at sorcery to give a creature -3/3, but it has cycling of 2, so you can pay 2 and discard it to draw a card, and Madness of 3 and a black. So basically, yes, you can cycle it and then Madness it. That's the whole joke.
That's the whole
thing. So this isn't really a Madness card in the sense that you don't need Madness outlets to enable it. So that's not the kind of card I'm really talking about here, though it's obviously a good card in the Madness deck because it's just a good card.
Right.
Black also has Rebels. It's the other color that gets Rebels. It has Blight Speaker. It's the 1 and a black for a 1/1. Human Rebel Cleric. At common, you tap, target player loses a life, which actually matters. It's a nice little pinger, only to the opponent. But you can also pay, like Amber's-Got 4 and tap it and search for a Rebel that costs 3 or less, put it on the battlefield. And it has Wrathy Trapper as a 1 and a black 1/2 that has black tap target creature, which is just a good rebel and a good card for decks without rebels, but certainly great in rebel decks. And, there's a couple other rebels as well. So black can definitely play this rebels package that's pretty good.
Yeah, and you prioritize Blightspeaker at the same level that you do the Scout. Basically, as many of those as you can get. And then what you'll find is it's kind of funny, this deck, if you get a Blightspeaker, usually you search up another one first, similar to the Scout. And then if you have more, you just keep getting them. And all of a sudden, these Blightspeakers just sit here and start chewing away at your opponent's life total while you're generating advantage. Because the thing to remember with Blightspeaker and Scout is that you're still drawing a card every turn. Like when they finally run out of targets or your opponent kills your Blightspeaker or whatever, then you just start deploying the stuff that you've been drawing this whole time. And these Blightspeakers are really annoying. They add up fast and they're common like the Scout. So you'll actually see a lot of them. Prioritize those, then get the other rebels a little bit later. And the Black-White Rebels deck's almost certainly going to be one of the better decks in the field.
Yeah, I do want to note that there's no rebel that I wouldn't play once I had a couple Rebel Seekers, that they can get. There's no three or less cost rebel that I wouldn't put in my deck if I had 2 Blightspeakers, for example. I mean,
yep.
Sometimes due to space concerns, you might not end up running every rebel. Once you have like 6, you don't really need the 7th all that much. But in terms of quality, none of them are unplayable. It's just getting free cards is great.
Yeah.
And it kind of, to some degree, doesn't matter what you're getting past a certain point. Red has an Echo theme. So Echo is the mechanic where you cast it, and then at the beginning of your next upkeep, you have to pay its cost again or sacrifice it. So you're kind of getting an undercosted creature, but you have to kind of pay for it twice. And it's mostly got an uncommon, like, thick-skinned goblin. It's a red for a 2/1. And you can pay 0 instead of paying the Echo cost for permanents you control. So it makes all your Echo costs free. It also can pay a red to give pro red until end of turn for whatever reason.
Is it egregious to call this a thick-skinned goblin and then give it 1 toughness?
Yeah, it does seem a little bit rough for that to be the case.
How thick is that skin, actually?
Yeah, it's not particularly thick. And in general, Echo is not really a mechanic. It's not really anything but, hey, some of these cards have Echo. You don't really need to play around that or to try to draft in ways to utilize that. Yes, if I have a thick-skinned goblin, it's a fine card because sometimes it just hoses opposing red decks. Sometimes it'll come up where you won't have to pay Echo on one of your cards, but you really don't want to draft in a way that really takes that into account all that much. It's just not that powerful. So that's not a huge deal. Red has Storm, like we talked about, Empty the Warrens. It also has Grape Shot at common. That's the 1 in a red sorcery that deals 1 to any target with Storm. And Grape Shot, if you can reliably get it to 3, is really good. 3 mana divided any way you choose is going to kill like 2 creatures a lot of the time, sometimes even more. And so when you're trying to draft the Storm deck, you want Coal Stoker. That's the 4 mana 3/3 that adds 3 red. You want Suspend cards, and you want cheap spells. And we're not talking vintage cube Storm level decks where you're like, I'm going to Empty the Warrens for 26. It's more, I'm going to cast Empty the Warrens or Grape Shot with Storm, Storm count of 3, and that makes these cards better than the average card.
Value Storm.
Yeah, because there's a little bit of support for it too. Like there's Grinning Ignis. It's a 2 in a red for a 2/2, and you can pay a red to return it to your hand and add 2 in a red to your mana pool. So you basically, when you have this in play, first of all, if you untap with it in play, it's already in play. It generates +2 mana. Second, the whole loop costs 4 and it adds 3, so you get to spend 1 mana to get 1 storm as many times as you have mana for. So
and then the last one, you just keep the extra mana and cast your Storm card. Yeah.
Yeah, so you can do that. And there's a couple Storm cards, and there's like Storm Entity, which is a 1 red for a 1/1 haste, and it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter for each other spell cast this turn. So it gets +1/+1 for each spell. But Storm's a deck which is fun, but doesn't come together all that often. It's kind of like Vintage Cube, where you shouldn't really be going after this, but if it falls into your lap, it can be good.
Yeah, you mentioned the suspend thing real quick. That's really important, right? That is the way to get ahead while also building out your board or casting relevant stuff.
Well, it's good for 2 reasons. One is that it's the easiest way to get Storm going because you start the turn with a card coming off. You're already at Storm 1 without doing anything. And the second is it's generally good to put a bunch of suspend cards in your deck. The suspend cards are good. So you're not putting a bunch of Pyretic Ritual type cards in your deck that are unplayable without Storm. You're like, hey, I have 2 Keldon Halberdiers, and I have a Coal Stoker, which is also just a fine card by itself. Yeah, I'm going to put an Empty the Warrens in my deck because sometimes I'll line these things up.
Yeah, there you go.
Red also is a madness color, and red is kind of interesting because blue is the enablers, black's the payoffs. Red has both payoffs and enablers, and they're also pretty powerful. Like Reckless Worm is 3 red for a 4/4 trample, but has madness of 2 in a red. Right, this is a color shifted arrogant worm, and one of the really big payoffs. If you go turn 2 Luteral Core, turn 3 play a land, attack, discard, and play a Reckless Worm, you have a 3 mana 4/4 trample out on turn 3,
and you drew a card. Yeah, you're way up in that scenario.
They upshifted Lightning Axe to uncommon, which makes sense because the card is pretty nutty. It's red for an instant, deals 5 to any creature, and you either have to discard a card or pay 5 colorless in addition.
Yeah.
And this is one of the best Madness enablers because it's just a great card. You're not really going to get this late in your Madness decks, but when you compare Lightning Axe with like Dark Withering, that's the classic. You pay a red and a black to kill 2 creatures.
This is absurd. And those turns always feel really busted from the opponent perspective too, because they're like, I'm doing fine, and then they just lose like 2 5/5s in one turn or whatever.
Yeah, so Timespiral is funny because, like you mentioned, it's not drastically higher power level than other limited formats. A lot of the things that are good in limited are across normal formats are good here. You know, your calibration is not going to be like way off. But yeah, it does have these really like combos, these uber combos that when they come together, you're like, whoa.
Yeah,
you know,
they do.
I mean, some games you go like, turn 1 suspend Dirkwood Baloth, turn 2 suspend Errant Ephemeron, turn 3 suspend Giant Hornet, and then all of a sudden like you're just attacking your opponent with a bunch of 5/5s and 4/4 flyers that you didn't really spend any mana on, and you got to cast other spells in the meantime.
Yeah.
And it's like, whoa, where did this all come from?
It feels exactly like that, yeah.
So red has a really funny common, and I say funny because it actually kind of deserves to be on the top 5 common list for all colors. What it is it's Gathan Raiders. It's 3 red for a 3/3, and it has Hellbent. It gets +2/+2 when you have no cards in your hand. But it also has Morph, and the Morph cost to unmorph it is discard a card. So what this card does, and I find it really funny that they included this, because this card means any morph your opponent has could be a Gathan Raiders.
Yes.
At all times, their morphs could actually secretly be a 3/3 or a 5/5 if they only have 1 card in hand.
Mm-hmm.
So you really got to be careful because you might not want to attack your really high value 2/3 into their morph because all of a sudden it's a Gathan Raiders and you're just like destroyed.
Yeah, because normally, the way that morph plays out is that there's a cost associated with with unmorphing it that usually has mana. Most morph cards have a mana cost tied to them. In fact, the last time that we saw morph, they made sure to not only include a mana cost, but also standardize that mana cost so that there weren't these absurd blowouts. But Gathan Raiders throws all that out. It's one of the few morph cards that you can flip up for no mana at all, which means that you can put it into any color of deck because the morph is for free. And like Luis said, if you happen to be Hellbent, meaning you have no cards in hand, it's also a 5/5. But this is just the ultimate bluff caller, right? Just like, you don't have any mana up. I'll send in with my 2/3, like you said. And it's like, oh my God, the blue black deck just flipped up Gathan Raiders and ate my creature. Like, how often would you see yourself playing Gathan Raiders in non-red decks?
You should always put this card in your deck.
Just always.
There's no deck that should not play this card. It reminds me a lot of Zombie Cutthroat, which was a couple years before Timespiral. That was a morph from Scourge, and it was or Legions rather, and it was a 3 mana 2/2, right? A morph, but you could pay 5 life to unmorph it, and it was a 3/4, and like it was the best common in every color. So
yeah,
you really have to watch out for Gathan Raiders, and it's one of the cards like Timespiral. They're just leaning into it. This is Timespiral. There's gotchas. There's no, all morphs are standardized. They all cost 5 to unmorph. You can
no training wheels on these morphs.
Oh no. Sometimes you're gonna get run into a Gathan Raiders. It's just gonna feel like complete and utter nonsense. Sometimes they're gonna unmorph some other ridiculous cards.
Can I discard more than 1 card to Gathan Raiders, or does it?
You cannot.
Okay.
No, you can only pay the morph cost once, and it's also a Madness enabler, as it turns out.
Yeah.
One of the better ones because it costs 0 mana to do it. So yeah, watch out for Gathan Raiders. And then green has Saprolings as its main theme. So it's got a bunch of cards that at the beginning of your upkeep, you get a spore counter, and then you can remove 3 spore counters to make a 1/1 Saproling. They have things that sacrifice the Saprolings. They have things that make it so you only need to remove 2 counters to make a thing. There's things that put extra counters on it. And overall, Saprolings is a pretty strong theme. It's got some pretty good cards. Sporoloth Ancient is the kind of headliner common. That's the 3 green green 4/4, and it gets a counter every turn. But all your creatures have the ability to remove 2 spore counters to make a Saproling. So it gives you 33% more Saprolings, and that ends up kind of adding up because there's a lot of cards that make it. So it's like a common Saproling lord that's good by itself.
Yeah, turbo Saprolings on a body that you already would play. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one of Green's themes and one of the louder ones. There's also a couple, there's like a 1 black and 1 white Saproling uncommons that kind of pay you off for having Saprolings. So, just keep an eye on those that you might want to splash sometimes or maybe play in a 2-color deck. And then Green also has like kind of a sub-theme of 5-color fixing with Search for Tomorrow, Green Seeker, and Gemhide Sliver all at common. In general, Timespiral does not have good fixing compared to like modern sets where we often have like a cycle of common duels or anything like that. So don't expect to play more than 2 colors in most of your decks. The main exception is the green deck, which can sometimes just go all the way up to 5. Once you have 2 Search for Tomorrows, a Green Seeker, and a Gemhide Sliver, yeah, you have a pretty good reason to play like one of most of the basic land types and then just play 4 or 5 colors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know if I put it in our individual card discussion, but what is the overrun called again?
Trump the Domains. It's 5 and a green. It's a sorcery, and it gives all your creatures +1/+1 in trample for each land type among basic lands. So, if you're 5 colors, it's +5/+5, and it does a lot. The best green common though is Sprout Swarm. So it's 1 and a green, and it puts a Saproling into play. And it has buyback of 3 colorless. It has Convoke. You can tap a creature to pay for it, so it just goes off exponentially. As
they were nice to us and they took it out.
Yeah, I know.
I did have a story that I read from one of Rosewater's articles about it that was. We'll just mention it now, but Sprout Swarm is. I mean, it's on the top 8 probably of best limited cards of all time. It completely broke the format. They didn't, it was before they really had those checks and balances in, and it was like, this seems cool. And they just threw it in, and then it was like, oh no. And like you said, it has, both Convoke and buyback. It just makes a 1/1, but, you always bought it back, and then it pretty quickly was able to pay for itself with its own creatures. And at that point, it just completely snowballs. And, apparently the design team, because it is an iconic card for better or worse, was like, okay, well, let's try it at uncommon and see what happens. And they played it and they're like, yeah, no, this is just too busted. Let's try it at rare. So they bump it up to rare and they tried it and they're like, this is just too disruptive. Like they just didn't even like it at rare. So then they thought about going to mythic, but they're like, okay, let's just cut this stupid card from the set and save our players the misery. So yeah, poor Sprout Swarm didn't make it over. It's probably the most iconic card, at least for us limited players that didn't. I mean, it's the standout card from this entire block for limited.
I mean, when they do Timespiral like flashback drafts on Magic Online, they just remove Sprout Swarm. It's the only time I can ever remember them doing that.
Yeah.
Except in some cases a card is bugged and they just cut it. But like Sprout Swarm was just nonsense. It actually ruined the format. Like
it might have been the worst printed mistake common, right, for limited. Like
I think it and Sparksmith are probably the two. If you haven't played an Onslaught block, that's a 1 and a red for a 1/1 goblin, and goblins was a theme. Tribal was a theme in this block. So there's lots of goblins, and you tap it and it deals X damage to target creature or X the number of goblins in play, and you take X damage. But how it played out is they played a Sparksmith on turn 2. You played a creature. They play a goblin, shoot and kill your creature, and then you're like, oh, right, I cannot progress this game. It was a common for 2 mana.
That's insane.
So dumb. So yeah, I mean, I think Sprout Storm, obviously, I understand, like, oh, cool, we can combine buyback and convoke, and it makes a token. Look at how it all feeds itself. But it probably did just about the most damage to a limited format as you can, because when we talk about a card like, oh, Glorybringer should be mythic instead of rare, sure, I think that actually would have made Amonkhet a little bit better. It doesn't really matter. Like, the frequency of Glorybringers at rare is still just not that high, not enough for me to say it ruins the format. I think people are being really hyperbolic when they say that. And even uncommons that are a bit too good, I don't know. Uncommons don't show up at such a rate that I care. Commons, yes. If you print a common like Sprout Swarm, you're substantially making the format work.
Yeah. So we will not be seeing Sprout Swarm, and trust us, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So talk about the themes here, because that covered green, right?
Yeah, so that's all the themes. And so if I had to rank the themes, and again, we'll see how this shakes out, but this is based on my prior experience with Time Spiral, then also looking at which cards they chose to include. I think that morphs is the fifth best, going from 5 down to 1. Again, not a really big theme, but playing a bunch of good rate morphs is actually a pretty good combination because, like I mentioned earlier, once you've shown them some good morphs, they kind of have to kill your morphs aggressively to stop them, and it makes all your morphs that much more threatening. So a deck with 1 morphs it's much better to have a deck with 4 morphs than 1 if you have some good ones. Mm-hmm. Saplings is a strong theme. If you get the good sapling makers, it's really hard for your opponent to make any headway on the ground, and you can often kind of just outpace them with those. They do give you free cards after all. And then Madness, black is almost always a color of the Madness decks. You can have a light Madness deck, just a little Madness, where you're playing like a blue-red deck that has 3 or 4 discard outlets and like 2 Madness cards. But any deck that you would want to describe as a Madness deck probably has black, because it probably has like 4 or 5 Madness cards, mostly in black, and then ideally 4 or 5, about a 1-to-1 ratio of discard cards and outlets if you can swing it. Sometimes you'll have more of one than the other. Mm-hmm. And then the top 2 themes are Rebels, actually. Yeah. Black Rebels, then White Rebels. Rebels is just really strong. And one thing to note with these themes is the themes are also just not even close to all that's going on in this set. We've mentioned time and time again that the set is a lot about these like micro synergies, these like little pairs of cards, and making sure your cards work together well. So the themes are part of it, but they went kind of light on the themes compared to like the sets that we normally look at these days. And I think that is probably a good thing because it just lets you show off the cards. Plus, when you're going to put in 50 one-off weird oddball cards, it would naturally disrupt your themes, and those oddball cards do. They just happen to work together with other cards in the set.
Yeah, one of the things that it doesn't count as a theme perfect is what we mentioned before about Suspend. I'm planning on playing a heck of a lot of Suspend cards. That's one of the decks that the colors that have a bunch of Suspend are the ones that excite me. That curve that you mentioned with the Baloth on 1 into the Ephemeron both suspended is awesome. But it's not really a theme, right? Those are just good cards that you put in your deck, and you're actually better off not supporting it as a theme, as we mentioned before. So there is more going on here, but I agree. I was going to say we normally do this near the end, but we'll just pop this one in here. If you're going to draft this set just a couple of times and you're feeling a little overwhelmed and a little like, I don't know what the heck's going on here, Rebels. Draft Rebels. Trust us. Take Amru Scout, take Blight Speaker, and then take Rebels. It's straightforward. It's not a complicated deck. Activate the damn things every single time you can and get a bunch of stuff on board. And the deck kind of plays itself as far as like, oh, I can start tapping this now that I don't do this other thing. And you'll just sort of be able to kind of flow with it. And it doesn't require you to have some crazy rules knowledge. It's all right there on the card. And incidentally, it's often overlooked by people who haven't played in these formats before. A card like Amru Scout is kind of like, I don't really know what I can get with it. Are Rebels even a thing? How many could I even get? You're like, I'll just take this removal spell, or I'll just take this more powerful card on the surface. So you just scoop up all these Rebels and you'll do just fine if as long as you're not fighting like 2 other people for them. So there you go. You want to go over some of the top commons from the colors?
Yeah, let's take a look. We'll be a little faster on these because we're going to go through all the colors. But for white, my preliminary list is a Temporal Isolation at 5. That's the removal spell. It's the pacifism with flash, but what it does is it gives the creature shadow, so it can't even chump or anything like that.
And it also prevents all the damage that it would do.
Yeah, so it just gives the creature shadow and prevents all the damage. So it effectively removes it from as a game piece from the board. Yeah. Pretty strong card. Amru Seekers, that's the 3-mana 2/2, can only be blocked by white or artifact creatures. Mostly on there because it's a rebel. Just because most white decks, you're going to want to pick up 1 or 2 of these to search out with your Rebel Searchers. Sunlance. White gets a lot of good removal in this set. This is a sorcery. It's 1 white mana to deal 3 damage to target non-white creature. So it's a very efficient removal spell against non-white decks. And then number 2 and 1, Bound in Silence, the actual pacifism for 3 mana that's a Rebel. And then, of course, Amru Scout is number 1. And Amru Scout's just the best by a lot. Like, there's not that many situations where I wouldn't take, like, where I'd take any of these over Amru Scout. The exception is if it's like pick 2 or 3, pack 3, have no other rebels somehow, but I'm in white, which not super often, but could happen. I would probably take Bound in Silence over Amru Scout because if you don't get any rebels, of course, Amru Scout's really not that good. Mm-hmm. So you do want to, make sure you're going to be able to fill that up. Another white card I want to mention is Momentary Blink. This is like you said, the card that gives gave us rise to the whole Blink deck and name convention, and Momentary Blink kind of makes a blue-white archetype by itself, right? It's 1 and a white exile creature, then it immediately comes back into play. So what it does is it dodges removal spells, it knocks off enchantments like Bound in Silence and Temporal Isolation, and most importantly, it re-triggers Enter the Battlefield effects. And then because it has flashback, you get to do this twice. The blue-white Blink deck was a very real thing. If you ever got God forbid, a Riftwing Cloudskate with a Blink, the game was often just over because you got to bounce 3 things for very low investment of mana.
Yeah, and at instant speed too, you can really manipulate the board with stuff like that. Yeah.
And also not at the same time. So what'll happen is you'll Riftwing their creature, they'll replay it, you'll Blink, bounce their creature, they'll replay it, you'll flashback, Blink, bounce their creature. That's a lot stronger than having to bounce their best 3, just bounce their best one 3 times.
Take that, Dirkwood Bailoff.
Yeah. Blue also has some pretty strong commons. Again, this set is stronger than a normal set, even though it's more in line with normal sets than Masters sets. It's got a Dreamscape Artist, the spell shaper that casts Harrow in 5, mostly because of its inroads into Madness. You don't really want this card in your deck if you don't have Madness cards. It's just okay. It's not great. Mm-hmm. Fathom Seer, this is a really good one. This is 1 and a blue for a 1/3, but it has Morph. And the way to unmorph it is to return 2 islands to your hand, so it doesn't cost any actual mana. And then when it unmorphs, you draw 2 cards. So it casts Gush to unmorph. Mm-hmm. And this card is a really strong card. It's not as strong as it was in Timespiral because damage used to stack back then. Don't need to get into all that, but this effectively played as a 2/3 the turn you unmorphed it. But even now, if you're going to miss a land drop, this effectively, adds a mana, right? Because imagine it's turn 4, you don't have any other lands in hand, and you have 3 lands in play. Well, you can float 2 if you have 2 islands, return 2, draw 2, play a land, and now you have access to 4 mana. Of course, you're going to be down on mana in the future because you did have to return 2 lands, but it still gives you that little mana boost, while also being a 1/3 that draws you 2 cards, like a mini Muldrifter. Mm-hmm. So Fathom Seer is very good. Card I take highly. Then, of course, Looter Ilkor, the Shadow Looter. And then number 2, I have Foresee. This is 3 and a blue sorcery. It's a pretty strong card. You get to scry 4 and then draw 2 cards. So this is Behold the Multiverse, but scry 4 instead of 2. Of course, it doesn't have, the whole suspend thing. Well, foretell thing. Right. This is the actual suspend set. But Foresee is really good. You wanted to take Harmonize out of that pack. Foresee, I think, is arguably stronger than Harmonize, or at least in the ballpark.
It is, I think, because it's draw 2 spells minimum, and it also digs you up to, 6 cards deep?
Yeah, if you cast this at a point where you don't need lands, I think this is stronger than draw 3 because it lets you put all the lands you see in those top 4 cards on the bottom. And if you're digging for a specific card, you're like, if I draw Lightning Axe this turn, I win. Well, this lets you see 6 cards to find it. Yep. So very strong card, also splashable. But I have Errant Ephemeron at number 1. It's just hard to compete. 2 mana, 4/4 flyer. And blue, look at what blue has. It's got Errant Ephemeron, Undercosted Threat, and then it's got 3 different card draw spells.
Yeah, I like it. So, especially the Madness Enabling, but yeah.
So black is pretty Madness and Rebel centric. We've got Gorgon Recluse at number 5. That's the 2/4 pseudo Death Touch with Madness. Then Wrathy Trapper, because I like Wrathy Trapper even outside of Rebel decks. This is the Tapper. And then Blight Speaker. It's actually only the 3rd best black common because there's 2 reasons. One, black's Rebel hits are a little weaker than white's. It doesn't have a removal spell to get like Bound in Silence. And even though Wrathy Trapper is quite good, white has more Rebels overall. So number 2 and 1 are the 2 black removal spells. Ichor Slick, the one I talked about earlier where you get to Madness it, cycle it, then Madness it. And then Strangling Soot at number 1. This card was a beating. This is 2 and a black. It's an instant. Destroy target creature with toughness 3 or less. So it's effectively deal 3, right, for 3 mana because it can kill a 3 toughness or less creature. Mm-hmm. It has flashback of 5 and a red. So you do have to be black-red to take full advantage. But the way this ends up working out is you play this card, and if you're black-red, it's just a great card. If you're not red, you can usually sneak a red sorcerer or 2 or 3 into your deck, and then sometimes flash it back. But 3 mana, 3 mana kill a 3 toughness or less creature is still a good card. And I think it and Ichor Slick are very close because Ichor Slick's also, it's also a 2-for-1 when you cycle Madness it. But Strangling Soot gives you a 1-for-1 for cheap on 3, and then later you get your second card by paying more. I think that's better than having to pay 6 up front to get your second card.
Yeah.
So
okay,
they're both really good though.
Really on par. Yeah, 2-for-1s. Yep.
Red has a Reckless Worm at common, number 5 here. That's the 4/4 Madness Worm. Keldon Halberdier at number 4, and that's the suspend 1 for a 4/1 first strike. Good with Storm, just good card in general. Dead Gone at number 3, and this is a split card. You can only cast one of the two halves. The two halves being red for an instant to deal 2 to target creature, or 2 in a red, return target creature you don't control to its owner's hand. And what's nice about this card is it's mostly shock. It's probably, 70% of a shock, or 70% of the time is a shock. But the 30% of the time that shock isn't good, unsummoned tends to be pretty good. Bouncing a creature is pretty good when they have nothing shockable, because that probably means they've got like a 5/5 in play. Also, it's nice. Red doesn't usually get that effect. That was part of like the, messing with the color pie thing.
I hate all that stuff, but whatever. It's part of the story.
Gathan Raiders is number 2, and I want to put a note. I did want to break out the top 5 commons for each color, but realistically, Gathan Raiders is about the 3rd or 4th best common in every color. Okay. So I would take Gathan Raiders. Like if you look at black, I would take it over Gorgon Recluse and Wrathy Trapper. I would just take Gathan Raiders at probably like around number 3 or 4. So it's a nonsense card.
Yeah,
it's just so good. I mean, like looking at white, I guess I would take it number 3. So and. Realistically, pick one, pack one. It's almost going to be better than all of them because it's colorless. It's just a colorless card you can take. So
right.
kind of like I said, nonsense. And then Riftbolt, I think, is the best red common because it's just 2 in a red, deal 3, but also suspend 1 and suspend for just a single red mana. So a great storm enabler because you can always line it up for when your Keldon Halberdier is also coming in, right? You suspend it the turn before. And 3 mana for a deal 3 at sorcery is good. 1 mana for a deal 3, also very good.
Right. And what about for green?
Well, Sentinel Woodreaders comes in. That's the one that you like, the 6 mana 1/4 that draws 2 cards.
I love that one.
Followed by Dirkwood Baloth, the suspend 1 mana for a 5/5 with suspend 5. And then Penumbra Spider. I really like the Spider. It always did more work than you thought. This was 2 green for a 2/4 reach. And when it dies, you get a 2/4 reach.
Yeah.
So it's 2/4 reaches for 4 mana, of course, not at the same time. But when you were playing like Grixis Grindy deck, or Black-Red Grindy deck, which was one of the decks that, I drafted fairly frequently, and they played a Penumbra Spider. It was just like, ugh.
It is
like
tough.
This is gonna eat so much of my removal.
It does, and it's impossible to attack through because it's 2/4 with reach, so all your stuff gets bricked.
Sporloth Ancient, the 5 mana 4/4 that makes Saprolings for just 2 counters each. And then number 1, I just like the Gemhide Sliver. I don't even really consider it a sliver. Obviously, it opens the door to going into slivers, but you should just take it as a really powerful mana dork that leaves your options open.
Okay, so there you go. That covers the best commons. There was a few kind of individual stuff that we wanted to mention as well, just interesting stuff, whatever. Some of it we've got to already. Suspend is better than it looks. We talked about Sprout Swarm and Momentary Blink as well. I also mentioned briefly that slivers are focused in red, green, and white. There are actually slivers that are outside of that, but they happen at the higher rarities. So if you are going to try to draft the slivers deck, you do want to keep in mind that you're going to be primarily red, green, white. Now, you could pick 2 of those colors to pair up if you got enough slivers, but it's pretty likely that you're going to need that Gemhide Sliver that Luis just mentioned and try to get into at least 3 of these colors, if not splashing for a 4th. That's where the real power comes in, because if you reach into 3 colors for slivers, then you have a good chance of having basically all of your cards, all of your creatures be slivers outside of maybe, say, 3 to 5 of them, which are just powerful other, non-sliver cards. But slivers 100% rewards you for being all in on slivers. Like at some point, it's just, if it's castable and it says the word sliver on it, you just take the damn thing, and you'll they're the ultimate tribal deck. And then the one thing to mention also about playing them out that Luis touched on before as well, but it's really worth noting here, is that these slivers do pump opposing slivers, so it makes combat weird, and the fact that you could actually be helping out your opponent is kind of a feel bad. But I think that for the most part, the slivers really do need other slivers to be good. So you're not going to have people with just random one-off slivers too often. So you should be okay, but do keep it in mind. Another thing to keep in mind here with regards to combat that's not related to slivers is that combat in this block is going, or in this set, is going to be extremely difficult compared to the way that we have it now. Not only do we have a whole bunch of high toughness creatures and stuff that could stall out the board, 1/4s, 2/4s with reach, that kind of stuff. But beyond that, there's a lot more that messes with combat numbers, like Saltfield Recluse is a good example. You tap it to give a creature -2, -0. Just having that sitting on the battlefield can make your life extremely difficult if you're trying to attack your opponent. The Absorb Sliver is one that comes to mind as well. These things make combat a lot tougher. And when you add that to Morph, where you're dealing with a really Wild West Morph scenario here, where there could be anything from Gathan Raiders up to morphs that flip up for free that are on color or not, or that are expensive and do big things. And you're just not going to know that often, where you don't have these handlebars that kind of say, okay, you know, if you're on this turn, then that morph can't get flipped up unless it's in this category, which don't do that much. That is just completely off the table. And that's going to make life very, very difficult as far as combat goes. Then there's other stuff like flanking, etc. So just keep that in mind that this is going to be a complicated set for combat. That said, when it comes to Morph is awesome. And if this is your first time playing with it, this is diving into the deep end of the pool. So, you know, be ready to swim. But I think that even in that scenario, you will enjoy Morph and you will say, okay, I get it. This is cool. This adds a whole different dimension to the game. And it also adds a casting cost flexibility that helps out a lot if you've stumbled a bit on your mana. Tysus.
I do want to mention, by the way, I'm really glad they upgraded Saltfield Recluse to uncommon. This is the 3-mana 1/2 that gives a creature taps to give a creature -2, -0. Mm-hmm. That card was just brutal. This is the
card.
The on-the-board trick card that they stopped printing for, they had a good run, but about 7 years. Then they started printing them again for who knows what reason. But there was a long time where they did a good job of not printing cards like this, which at common, which I mean, this is now uncommon, but on-the-board tricks that are just really, really hard to beat. I mean, Saltfield Recluse, yes, it only gives one creature -2, -0, but it effectively gives all your creatures -2, -0, because any combat you get involved in, one of your creatures is going to get -2, -0. And I remember I felt so bad for one of my opponents. I played it, the Modern Masters Grand Prix in Vegas, the first one, just like the huge one.
4,000 people.
Yeah. They're all huge, and it was like the last round. We're playing for like top 16 or top 32 or whatever it was. And they make an attack. And I block, and I solve for Recluse, and they just bin their like 4/4 flyer for literally no value.
Oh,
there's just like a bunch of people watching, and it's just like, yeah, this is why these cards aren't good. And Saltfield Recluse is, I'm not going to say it's a bomb, but it's very good. This card was an obscene common, and I'm glad they upshifted it.
And it is a rebel, right?
Yes, you can also go get it at some point. So that's it does have summoning sickness, so it's not like a mega on the board trick there or whatever.
Right. But it's definitely a premium target for the two seekers there. I mentioned if you're going to sit down and you haven't played the format at all and you're only going to be playing it a couple of times, that Rebels would be a good place to start. What would you recommend in addition to that? Is there any other archetypes that you'd feel comfortable recommending, Luis? Because I know you're going to jump right into madness, whatever nonsense. but you know, if you never played these cards.
I think that the easiest two entry-level archetypes besides Rebels are Madness and Storm. So I actually think Saprolings is actually pretty good because to draft Saprolings, you do the thing you think you want, which is to draft more cards that make Saprolings.
Yep.
They all tend to work together. And yeah, you want some payoffs for going wide and all that, but in general, Saprolings is a pretty easily grokkable archetype to draft. Also, just get acquainted with the cards. You know, like, I would say more than half of my Timespiral decks would not be described in one sentence like, oh, this is a Rebels deck, this is a Madness deck. Mostly, oh yeah, I drafted blue-black. Oh, what do you have going on, Madness? No, I only have one Madness card, but I had such and such, you know. Yep. So don't worry too much about missing out on themes. You can kind of just take the cards that look good for you and kind of calibrate from there.
Yeah, I want to jump into the 4 or 5 color deck with Tromp the Domains. I mean, if you get Tromp off for 4 or 5, you don't need much. Normally we think of those effects as like, I've got this army of tokens and I'm going to take advantage by winning. But if you have like 2 decent sized creatures and you get a Tromp off for 4 or 5, you're adding 8 or 10 damage, and plus all the damage that you're getting from trample that you wouldn't have otherwise. It can make it so that your opponent dies right then. And if you have any type of board at all, like a mediocre, 3 to 4 creature board, the game's over. So, that's the kind of thing that you can try to take advantage of as well. Okay, let's call it a show there, Luis. Again, this set comes out tomorrow. So hopefully people get a chance to play it. Send us pictures if you do, and let us know what's working for you and what's not. This is a little different this is an amalgamation of all the 3 sets, as we mentioned before. So this is a new set in effect. It's just using the cards from there, but it should be a significant power level up. One thing I did want to mention is those new design tools and approaches that they have. They used to just put cards into sets back even during this time that just didn't do anything for anything. Like, they weren't good limited cards. They weren't constructed cards. They didn't go into Commander. There was really nobody that would be interested in a good chunk of cards. And I think that they thought that was an important part of designing a set, was kind of putting in these, what did they call them? The ones that teach you lessons. Do you remember that? They had a name
skill
for
testers.
Skill testers. That's what it was. Yeah. Skill testers. Right. And I think that they thought that a balance of good and also some bad cards was important, but they don't do that now. Basically every card in the file has a job to do, and it might not be the job that you think it should. Like, it might be a card for a format that you don't play, and that's kind of why it's in there. But it has a job to do. And now they're able to with that many cards available from a major set plus 2 expansion blocks, they were able to put together a set here that has a similar, in fact, even a higher level of quality. So anyway, the set should be powerful, but again, don't think of it as a Modern Masters style set. It's not quite on that level. It's not Cube, but it's definitely going to be up there. And it should be really interesting. This one is for the hardcore draft junkies, particularly the longtime drafters. But this one is made for a big chunk of our audience. So get out there and play it and enjoy it and let us know what you think. If you would like to buy it, may I suggest that you go to channelfireball.com. You can get Timespiral Remastered over there and use the affiliate code LR. If you do pick up something over there, again, it helps out the show and we appreciate it. And while you're over at CFB, you can get CFB Pro as well. That gets you access to even more in-depth content that can help you improve at your Magic game from some of the best Magic minds and also Luis Scott-Vargas. And, it's worth it. There's a bunch of different payment options that you can do to make it very, very affordable, especially if you spend a bit of money at Channel Fireball anyway. Then you can get it down to effectively free. You can check that out over at I have a link in the show notes for Channel Fireball, for CFB Pro, I should say. So you can check that out. And again, if you do, you can use the affiliate code on that too. That counts for that as well. So thanks for doing that. If you want to find us on social media, I'm Marshall_LR and Luis is LSV. And you can find everything related to this show over at lrcast.com, including like our streams, the Facebook page, which all I do is update when a show goes up. But some people are on Facebook all day for work or they love it for some reason. And so you can get updated when the show goes live via that if that's convenient for you. The YouTube channel. Of course, a big shout out to everybody on the LRcast subreddit as well. That's a great place to go for advice. Our social media, everything's on there on the front page of lrcast.com. That's going to do it for this one. We'll see you next week.
So I have a story about Split Second. It's a bit apocryphal. Like, I don't know. I can't, a lot of the stories I tell, right, are stories that I personally experienced or witnessed, and I can definitely tell you happened. The Benes claims I massively embellish them, and I counter that by saying I only minorly embellish them. Some of them don't even need embellishment.
No, especially not when he's around.
Yeah, any of the ones involving Shahar or Benes do not. No. But This story, I've heard it many times. No one is ever able to pin down exactly what players were involved, so it makes me think it's a bit of urban legend, but it's a funny story nonetheless. It involves Split Second because you were bemoaning, how little you like Split Second.
Yeah.
And so it's game 3. It's at the Pro Tour, of course. These always happen at the Pro Tour. Why wouldn't they? Mm-hmm. And one player has sudden shock in their hand, and their opponent at 2. And so they can win the game at any point. But they decide, you know what? This is a weird situation. They can't stop it.
Yeah.
Why shouldn't I keep playing?
Oh my! They're just going to play with their food? So
they played a game out. They were crushing, right? They got their opponent at 2. They had the sudden shock. But then the opponent slowly starts to mount a comeback. And they slowly start coming back in the game, and things get worse and worse. The opponent top decks multiple cards. The opponent gets to the point where they look like they're going to win the game, and then the player's sudden shock is like, "Hey, judge!" And the judge comes over. He's like, "Judge, I need you to use the restroom." And the judge is like, "Okay."
Oh my god!
They like leave their hand on the table. They go to the restroom. They take their time. They come back over and they flip over to sudden shock.
Oh
and say,
my god! Oh, that is so brutal. Are you not naming names to protect the guilty here?
You know what? So
you don't have to. I'm just curious.
I heard it was a player from the Netherlands who did this, but you know what? I honestly don't know who it was supposed to be, which makes me somewhat doubt the veracity of the story. But
so you're saying it's Frank Karsten? Is that?
It is almost assuredly not Frank Karsten.
He's like the nicest person.
You would tell the story to Frank, and Frank's like, wait, I don't understand. Why would they not sudden shock on the first opportunity? Because they would then win the game.
Yes, that's exactly.
Wow.
That's incredible. What a brutal
and I guess
we'll
do a double header because this is another good one. This I know did happen. And I think I told the story in LR, but at this point we've had so many episodes that
you can run back stories.
Tons of people have no idea.
Yeah.
The setting is Magic Online, and one of the players top decks to win the game. Their opponent, this is the person I know.
Oh, I know this person.
You know this story. So they top deck to win. So the protagonist of the story, I'm not going to say the good guy because you'll see.
Yeah.
They say like, I can't believe you top deck. That's the luckiest thing I've ever seen. They disconnect. So that's by itself bad behavior. But the opponent is who top decked is now like, wow, I'm playing against some just sore loser. They're salty. They disconnected. But you know what? I won. Whatever. The person who disconnected logs back on after 8 minutes because at 10 minutes that you lose the game. Logs back on after 8 minutes and just chars the opponent to win the game. Casts a burn spell to win the game. And as little as I condone the behavior, I have to be impressed by the cunning mind it takes to think, oh, what if I subverted their expectations by getting mad and disconnected and then coming back and winning the game?
It's just devious behavior.
Because then, can you imagine the swings where they top deck? They're really happy. You then, you then get salty and disconnect, and they end up, you end up like, well, I top decked, haha. They're disconnecting. What a sore loser. Whatever. I'll wait 10 minutes. I won the match. Great. Then they come back and char you, and then you're like, hold on. They complained about my top deck and disconnected, but they had the win, and you just get, God. You just set them up and then knock them down, and just unbelievable. Like,
I miss stories like that, but also like it has to be better without, right? Right? Or is it?
So yeah, there's some things you can do in this vein, but like I said, I'm not endorsing these actions. They are fun to talk about.